you ever could have imagined.
With that said, welcome to Education in Context, a space where we explore how education, community, and culture intersect within education to reimagine what learning can be for Black and Brown children. This is Beyond the Episode, where we're going to take this conversation that we had in episode one deeper with the brilliant voices that we have with us today and you, our community. Joining us live for this talkback is attorney Kamau Allen and Dr. Sarah Liddell-Montgomery. If you're a viewer that's just joining us, feel free to comment where you're from, where you're joining us from. As we delve into this conversation for Beyond the Episode, for episode one, I briefly just want to summarize the topic of episode one. Episode one was grounded in the text from The Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire. And the big topic that that book talked about was the ways in which our society and the people that live in our society exist either as the oppressor or the oppressed. So as we have this conversation today, we're just grounding our idea in that big idea, that big thought. I want to go ahead and jump right in. We have Dr. Kamau, I mean, not Dr. Attorney Kamau here. Kamau, can you share with us just your experiences that you've had just as an attorney and, any reflections that you had about the ways in which anti-Blackness shows up in your profession?
Yeah. Being an attorney, a Black attorney, and studying any aspect of our law is a constant reminder of the ways in which not just blackness, anti-Blackness is present in the law, but so much of our constitution, so many of our laws are warped by anti-Blackness. That anti-Blackness isn't a side feature of our law. I've seen in so many ways the ways in which it is the very structure itself. Like a really good example is as a matter of fact, when we look at Fourth Amendment issues where a police officer stops and frisks somebody, the constitutional justification for stop and frisk was actually invented as a way to justify an anti-Black suspicion of an individual who was arrested without any probable cause. And so, without going into all the facts of that case, the Supreme Court was able to almost entirely shift a well-placed standard within our Fourth Amendment, requiring an officer to have some kind of probable cause to allow officers to have reasonable suspicion, a much lower standard, all because in this case, an officer felt that his suspicion of a Black person in a white space was justified. And now, because of that, there is a constitutional justification for stop and frisk, which is something that happens routinely within Black and Brown communities today. And so that's just one example. But as a Black attorney as a criminal defense attorney, I see the ways in which my Black clients are treated much differently than my white clients. I see the ways in which my Black clients are the ones who get slammed on the hood of a car and who get handcuffed without saying anything, while my white clients get to mouth off to a police officer and not leave in handcuffs. I see the ways in which I step into the courtroom and there are people there who are not used to seeing a Black person in any position of power, especially in that particular setting. And so having people challenge my authority and having people challenge my expertise is something that is a feature of being a Black attorney. But most importantly, I believe that from what I've learned and what I've seen, I feel so much more equipped than I used to with being able to identify certain practices and institutions that are in desperate need of change. Not that you have to go to law school to know these things, but it was just helpful for my own understanding and from the vantage point that I had as a former community organizer. And so I see the opportunities in which as Black folks we can continue to organize, continue to build up power to overcome these systems, to fight these systems. And that's what I'm hoping to accomplish. So
Yeah, thank you for sharing, Kamal. I think a lot of what you mentioned right now is really getting at the ways in which our experience as Black people very much so intersect a lot of different parts of our society. Me and Neil focus on education, but we know what the legal system can do to a Black person that finds himself inside of it. And so I just appreciate you lifting that nuanced perspective. Um, If you could share with us just like your work in the field that you're in and how that connects to this bigger conversation about anti-Blackness, but just this episode when we think about how we need to frame education in the context in which it's happening.
Sure. So, um, I guess I'm looking at this from a intersectionality point of view. So, my current role as Dean of Students and Dean of Equity and Inclusion, I work for an early college program and an academy program. So, the academy is for your traditional ninth and 10th grade students in high school. And then early college is when students start college at like 16, maybe 17 years old, similarly to our program was in Chicago. And then independently, I do an LLC, S. Montgomery Solutions, with corporations across the country, not just education, on issues of equity and inclusion. And what I will say is, I think that anti-Blackness often shows up in ways that don't get talked about. They go unnamed and then they become institutional practice. And so if I'm existing in this space and I'm experiencing what, let's say, HR would categorize as a hostile work environment, it shows up sometimes in ways that the institutions will frame as this is our family, this is how we communicate. So, for example, if I was to sit in a meeting with a group of people and they're constantly cutting me off, they're not allowing me to join in on the conversation, they're overstepping my boundaries in multiple ways, and I say, hey, I'd like to be a part of the conversation, and they don't let me in, it's quite possible that HR will also join in on that harassment without knowing it, right? They may say, culturally, you just got to be a little bit more tough. You got to be willing to jump in and just kind of fight for a chance to talk. Everyone's desperate to talk, right? Without taking a moment to think about how my Blackness in that space is contributing to my inability to be heard specifically, right? And so I have to name that thing in that space and also worry about how that's going to be received too, right? So once you start naming things that make people uncomfortable, the next thing you have to deal with is the denial and the frustration of them having to learn and confront this new information that isn't actually new, but this pattern of behavior that's being called out, right? And so that affects people in every aspect of education and in their organizations outside of education. It also shows up in our classrooms, right? We bring in educators from across the country who show up in spaces unfamiliar with the student types that they're working with, right? So I'm thinking of a program like Teach for America. You get excited about this opportunity to get a paid master's degree, and your only stipulation is you've got to go into some of the more troubled, and I'm using that language that they use, troubled neighborhoods, and yeah, sacrifice your time to this school that really needs the support. But there is no institutional structure and framework that actually challenges even the language that the organization is using to categorize those schools that they're sending those teachers to. There is no framework that says actually we need to find out whether or not the educators we send there have any experience working with the population, the demographic of individuals they'll be working with. What type of biases are they presenting in their educational frameworks in the classrooms that could prohibit students from actually excelling in their course, right? And so when you start thinking about that and you start thinking about anti-Blackness in the classroom, we hear it come out as students can't learn, they don't want to participate, they aren't engaged, they aren't this, they aren't that. And there's never a step back where it's like, okay, well, what are we actually doing institutionally that's contributing to our students responding this way? Because it's almost always something happened in the classroom that's shutting someone down, and it's being unnamed, unaddressed, and it's institutionally praised, right? Oh, how many hours is our little black boy sitting in suspension outside of the classroom? Like, how many classroom hours are they not getting by this teacher who decided, I don't want to deal with that? But they came into the school already anticipating not wanting to deal with that. The same thing happens in corporate America. Black women show up in these spaces and they say, oh, I don't want to hear that. They don't say it out loud, but I'm gonna close you out from this meeting. I'm not gonna send you I'm gonna leave you off the email invite. All of those things that contribute to these hostile environments, these hostile workplaces, these hostile classrooms, show up in ways every day that go unchallenged, unannounced, and when they do, it's like cracking an entire egg open.
It's so crazy to hear you say that, Dr. Sarah, because Nell literally named that. She literally brought up in episode 1 a student that we actually both taught that was hearing that message from other teachers because, he's dealing with his own, life experiences outside of school. He's coming to school. He's, bringing that with him, trying to figure it out as I think he was maybe 10 or 11 at the time when I was teaching him. And it was just, I think two things are true. I think we cannot not acknowledge that children, especially in urban education, they are bringing trauma that we cannot then just put to the wayside when they get into the classroom and just start teaching them. We actually need to bring in that context and use that context so that we can figure out, okay, how do I support this child who clearly doesn't want to be in this classroom, not because they don't want to be in school, but because they're dealing with all the other things happening outside of the space.
And I think something important for us to think about is the ways in which like they might not want to be in school, and that is informed by the relationship they have to school because of the tropes they've internalized about what they can do at school. And so something we do talk about in the first episode is like what we don't name, we normalize. And I really appreciate Dr. Sarah saying this piece about like it is important to lean into the discomfort and the fear of saying the thing in these often predominantly don't look like us but are running schools with kids that do. It is important for us to say the thing because that thing is what actually changes the conversation. That disruption, them being uncomfortable and having to go educate themselves or having to reflect on their practices is important, right? And I'm very comfortable making people that don't look like me uncomfortable when they're in these spaces responsible for our kids, because at the end of the day, if you're always comfortable, something is wrong because the world is made around you being comfortable and you are the majority and you are privileged and you have X amount of power. You actually do need to be uncomfortable. You actually do need to be responsible for your actions and reflect on how you show up as it relates to our Black and brown staff, our Black and brown other leaders, and our Black and brown students that we're serving. Because transparently, like if you're not willing to do that, like there are schools with kids that look like you that you could be at. That's just at least how I feel. And I think that people don't want to hear that either. Like that makes them uncomfortable. And it's like if you're choosing to do this work with the students you're choosing to do this work with, know that you are accountable to how you show up and what you do. And it requires the labor to inform yourself about all of the biases that you could potentially project onto our students.
Yeah, I think that's one thing that I think we don't often speak about in education, specifically with new teachers, but also like, teachers who are veterans. Like you are coming into this profession with certain biases, whether you want to admit it or not. And we also do not train teachers. I think about anti-racist PD, but we don't train teachers to even begin to interrogate that so that when they get in front of children, they're not reproducing that harm. I see I see Dr. Sarah like, yep, that's exactly where I'm at with it.
I mean, no, both of you all are hitting right on the head. I mean, one of the things that I see behind the scenes is it's not just the educators, because one thing that people don't talk about is how much higher education influences everyone's behavior, because every single educator, lawyer, whoever had to go to a college in this day and time to be sitting in the classroom that they're sitting in. So I'd like to say that this system of not disrupting anything starts with the education of the person in that classroom, right? And so, I mean, this even came up with the conversation as an administrator. I said to my supervisor, I said, y'all don't like being told when y'all do something wrong. I said, but I'm going to tell you every time, because you have a culture of not feeling afraid to tell me when I've done something wrong. So I'm continuously having to change my practice. My practice is always being evaluated, always being looked at under scrutiny. So it's not uncommon for me to be uncomfortable because it's a cultural practice for you to scrutinize me. So it needs to become a cultural practice for you to want to be doing better because someone has told you that you're not doing well. I mean, and that makes people uncomfortable. It's like, oh, I don't want to be seen as inefficient, but you are being inefficient. And when I am, there's not a moment that a parent, that a faculty member, that a staff member won't say, oh, we don't appreciate that. You don't get a moment to breathe when you are a Black administrator to make a mistake. The catastrophes of mistakes that I've seen my white colleagues make, and walk away from the situation the same way that they get to walk away from it. So here is the confrontation, is this Black woman coming to you saying, hey, bro, I'm sorry, that's not appropriate. And let's talk about why that's not appropriate. But when you think about systems, look how easy it was for this current administration to come in and say, we're getting rid of that DEI stuff. And then they say, oh, white men, have y'all been hurt? You know, like those JG Wentworth commercials, submit a claim, and now they're looking into Nike talking about white men got a mistreat. I'm like, are you serious? I mean, DEI got watered down between, I would say literally between 2022 and 2024. There was this resurgence of DEI where people were coming in changing the definitions of words just to make white people comfortable learning it. I mean, if this is the system that we are bringing people out of, it's no wonder that as administrators we got all these coded systems that no one wants to talk about. You go in somewhere and they say things like, as an administrator, you hear that, what is it when they say, oh, we don't talk about that? It's just a unspoken expectation. I don't operate in that space. Don't give me any unspoken expectations and expect me to fulfill something that I don't even know about. And then guess what? You do that to the student in your class. You show up, you've got this idea about, oh, they need to show up and perform this way. And there's these unspoken expectations that get passed to you as an administrator that came from the school you went to, that came from the parents you came from who worked in that same system. And now you're doing it to the kids and you get frustrated because they don't speak that language. It's just like a system. It just keeps feeding itself.
And that's how these systems are inherently designed. Power
Hmm.
has a way of protecting and legitimizing itself. And so when we look at these sources of power in relation to the creation of racial identity, for example, you start to see how that trend has carried itself through the invention of particularly whiteness as an identity, as a racial identity that was made to be distinct and separate from other racial identities of the world in which they identified and categorized other people. Whiteness was inherently designed to be an us versus them identity. And when we look at some of the underlying justifications for an us versus them ideology, you start to see that a white identity as a whole does not exist separately from an enemy that needs to be created or identified and pushed up against. And so I believe I'm giving full credit to our viewers that they know that I'm not talking about white people as individuals, but that the idea and the justification behind a racialized identity created an us versus them situation. And what's a consequence from that is this need to protect their comfort around the institutions that help instill and legitimize power among a dominant racial group. And so we have so many examples of history where white comfort is routinely prioritized over Black and brown existence. I'll give you a really good example is the war on drugs, that it made white, especially the white majority as an electorate, as an electing and voting population, more comfortable to go against ideas of elusive ideas of crime and violence by locking up large scores of Black people. And we now know some 30, 40 years after the initiation of the war on drugs that doesn't have any real or tangible impact on the amount of violent crime that exists in any community. But this idea of white comfort demands that somebody needs to go to jail, that somebody needs to be deported, that somebody needs to be detained and arrested and searched and violated for me to feel comfortable. And so unpacking that through line in our history is a very difficult thing, because when you stand up in the institutions where you're at, no matter at what point in time in our history, as a Black person, to stand up against white comfort, you put your life, your job, your family at risk. And so I commend those who find the audacity to do that. And I believe that we should all have that audacity. Should we be martyrs? That's up to you. But I believe that the idea that disrupting that comfort is going to be key. And it's also key for white folks to do that. That we exist in anti-racism calls upon all of us to throw hands with racism.
I really appreciate you naming how this is not about individual people. And I think that's why people are so uncomfortable when things are named, right? When violences are identified, because they feel like it is a personal attack. Like, this is not about attacking you personally. I'm actually holding you accountable because I want you to be better, right? Like, I want you to be a better. I wouldn't hold you accountable if I didn't actually believe that you could do better, right? And I think that the biggest piece of, like, when we talked about in the first episode around like holding an identity as a Black administrator in a school, existing in the system and having to uphold portions of the system while still having these conversations with our Black and brown students, supporting them, advocating for them, etc., is very challenging, because you often sometimes see people that look like you who still are not safe, right? Because of the fact that they have chosen comfort and they have chosen safety and what that looks like to survive, even if it is at the expense of other people that look like them. And I think that that is very challenging. That has been the most challenging thing for me to navigate, because in my mind, I'm like, it's us, it's everybody. I'm rooting for everybody Black, whatever that Issa Rae line is. Like, I'm rooting for everybody Black. And so it really is hard to see someone that looks like you choose compliance, to choose like to succumb because they think it's the safe version. And I'm like, safe for who? Like, are you psychologically well choosing this? Like, do you feel like okay? Like, are you good? Blink twice if you not. Like, come on. And I think that that's something that has been the most challenging thing for me in charter, is like to work with people that look like you who don't have the knowledge that like the four of us on this call have, or have the knowledge and are still choosing comfort. And I think that it feels very scary for me as a mom to know that like I could maybe go to a school and be like, all right, cool, I see Black administrators, Black teachers, maybe my baby's a little bit safer here. But then to work with people that I'm like, oh no, this is a mindset that people have internalized, that you don't have to look like me. You could look like me and be safe. You could not look like me and be safe. Or you could look like me and be unsafe for my child. And you could not look like me and be unsafe for my child, right? Like, these are mindsets that we have to. And I actually would dissent the argument that Larry made that this work is not happening. This work is happening in schools across our country. It's not happening enough. It's not happening consistently, right? But in the East Coast charter, like, we had PDs that like specifically non-Black and brown people had to do around like, what are your biases you're coming to this work with? What does that mean you're going to need to do in order to engage in this work? And it's not happening like as much as it needs to happen, and it's not happening everywhere in our country, but it is happening because this is not a new phenomena. Like, it's not new. And I think that's the piece, is like us normalizing the anti-racist work and knowing that unlearning means us actively having to walk against, like, the like automated walkways at the airport. Like, you literally have to walk the other direction. Like, you can't just be like, let me walk a different speed. No, you have to turn around and walk the other way. And like, that is hard to do. It is hard to do when so many people are walking the direction of the flow.
Absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things I've been thinking a lot about is when the term anti-racist first started, getting popular. I'm going to say getting popular, because the work itself had already been a thing, right? Like, but people were using the term. And I said, I think I put a sour taste in a few people's mouths, because I was new to my profession, but I was also very hard, right? I was like, I'm not going to soften this up because you want me to. Like, I'm not doing that. And I remember saying to people, I said, oh, you want to be an anti-racist? You call yourself an anti-racist, right? And people would be like, yeah, I actively engage in dialogue about blah, blah, blah. They would go on this long tyrant about da, da, da. And I said, so you also acknowledge in that same space how you benefit from racism existing. Do you also disrupt that racism, or is it just the stuff that is easy to talk about? And that became a whole different, right? It was like anti-racism isn't just, oh, I was able to identify that pattern of behavior. It also becomes this work that means you also disrupted the pattern of behavior. And I think that's the part that no one wants to talk about when they say, oh, DEI work falls flat. It's falling flat because when administrators leave the schools that they work at, when teachers leave those schools and those places of employment that say, you need to do this, they go home and they say, and then in the car ride, they get it all out in the car and they can go home and they can be cuddled by racism in their houses. They can teach their kids all the words to say to be comfortable in a space so that they don't look problematic, but to act problematic regularly. And so then when the brown people who've been trained to recognize that say, actually, they can say, no, no, and then spew all this stuff. And that was the hard part for me, is that I weaponized you. When I started teaching you, when I started disrupting your patterns, when I started breaking things down so that you could understand it and make it tangible, you weaponized it and turned it into a way to ostracize me further. And now we got definitions of racism that don't even include power anymore. And then I say, oh, so you don't know what the 1999 definition from the Oxford Dictionary say. You know what the 2001 was. And so I said, well, let's take a look today. It's completely different. And then you go down this tangent of, well, who's the editor in chief of that magazine and what do they believe in? And that's how it shows up in spaces, right? I disrupted this pattern. I taught you how to recognize it. I'm teaching you how to disrupt it, but you stopped at disruption, because disruption for certain populations means that I no longer get a benefit that I benefited from because racism is being, removed, right? And so now I have to be uncomfortable in a different way. And that's the level of comfort that people have navigated in all of their lives. And so we are asking somebody for one moment, for a brief moment, to put themselves in the seat that we've sat in since our birth. How many of us on this whole life have sat in the room with our parents and have heard how to navigate a space? It might not show up like, let me teach you how to navigate a space. It's like, when you go out in public, you better not act no fool. You better not embarrass me. We get those conversations. And so then we go, don't go out there looking like that. Don't dress. Even dressing is a level of comfort that our colleagues show up. They could show up with purple hair, and it's like, okay, fine. I show up with purple hair. Oh, you're doing something different now. And there is this unspoken silence to why it's unprofessional for me to do that, and completely professional and fine for them to do that. So when you think about disrupting, and when you start talking about anti-racism and how it shows up when people actually start doing it and realizing that they benefit from racism existing, and the existence is exiting, is how we all thrive.
Yeah. No, thank you for lifting that. I think two things that I'm thinking about, and I really want to move us towards, what are the practical ways that we begin the disruption? And I say that because I remember my first year teaching. Wasn't thinking about this. I was thinking about, how do I teach this lesson? How do I teach? Because there's a science to it. And as a Black person, as a Black man that taught on the west side of Chicago, this was never a thought for me. And it took me 3 years into teaching to say to myself, you know what? I've been taught to facilitate this lesson in this particular way that feels very totalitarian. I don't know if that's the right word, maybe authoritarian, whatever the correct word is in this moment, but it didn't feel human. It felt very methodical, performative, especially when people walked in to observe me. And I think, at least for the people that work in a charter school setting and people that work at high performing public schools in general, like, they often are pressured to teach a particular way that is inherently anti-Black, and that where students who are Black and brown feel the brunt of that experience. And so I would like, and even Attorney Kamau, outside of the education in the attorney space, like, how do we begin to develop a mindset where people can interrogate their thinking and they can say, you know what, this doesn't feel appropriate because insert, I am thinking in this anti-Black way that I now need to unlearn.
But I think that it's twofold is what I'll
Hmm.
say. I know, Kamau, I saw you unmute yourself, so I'll be brief. But twofold, right? Like, I think, to Sarah's point that she made earlier around, like, the education we receive in higher education matters, because I was thinking like this in undergrad, right? Like, I was on the college policy debate team. I was having these arguments and these discussions and talking about, like, how policy was anti-Black, and, like, how anti-Blackness permeates the legal system, right? I was having this conversation, which informed how I approached education, which equipped me with the tools in my first year teaching on the East Coast in, like, the stars of all charter schools to be like, yo, this is anti-Black. Like, I actually don't need to manage my space like this, like, etc. Right. So I think higher education is the one piece, but then the other piece is like it starts from administrators like us on this call being equipped with that information so that if someone does not experience this education in higher when they're in higher ed, your job as a part of their coaching and development is to unpack that learning. And I'm often saying that to my teachers that I'm coaching. Like when I come in, I see them trying to perform for me right now. I'm like, pause, don't do that because I'm in here. Like, show up how you show up. Like, be real. You know what I'm saying? Like, don't do it because I'm in here, and I tell them that, like, I am your manager and your coach, but it's because I have a different set of responsibilities. I actually don't ascribe to hierarchy in that way, right? Like, I think I am here to support your development so you are better for our kids. If you're performing for me, you're not actually getting better for our kids. And I tell them that, like, it's not about impressing me. It's about doing the right thing for your kids, for your students, so they learn, And so I think us having to deconstruct that mindset as administrators is super important, which is why it is so important for us to be unafraid to say the thing at the leadership team meeting, like when we're in front of staff, because we are setting the precedent and we are informing the pedagogy of what is informing the policy of our schools when we are having or not having these conversations.
No, that's really powerful. And it's also just a really powerful question. How do you disrupt these things? How do you stop the no, to use Nell's analogy, to walk against that grain of like the escalator, what is it called? The whatever that thing is at the airport, you gotta walk against that. I want to add a couple of things that for one, when we talk about this system, when we talk about this structure, it's important for us each and every one of us to recognize that we have been socialized to believe that each of us has something to gain by being complicit with that system. And the lighter you are, the more and more true that is. That white folks were able to exchange their ethnic identity in exchange for getting the power of whiteness, such as the Irish and the Italians, for example. But even for those of us who are Black, we have been trained to believe that complicity, that there's safety in complicity. And when we look back at certain times in our history, there are some moments where, at least on an individual scale, that was true. But I think about the ways in which our ancestors were able to disrupt in ways in which that also preserved their own physical safety as well. I think about our African ancestors who, when they were forced here in chains, still retained parts of their language, their culture, their religion to the point where we still practice some of those things today without knowing where those traditions come from. That in and of itself was an act of disruption, to say that you will not take everything away from me, that I will still teach these dances. I will still teach these culinary practices, that we will still worship Shango and Ogun in the form of the Holy Spirit. And I think what that demonstrates is that in order for us to be disruptive, we first have to disrupt the sense of solidarity that we're taught to have with these systems in place. And that's a that's a hell of a thing to ask some people to do, because now you're talking about, for some people, their sense of identity, their sense of place in a position of power. That to say, well, if I become a disruptive person, then I'm bad. Then I'm somebody that's going to be punished. Then I'm not a team player anymore. And so being able to disrupt that commitment, I think, is one of the first things to do. And then the other thing is that this system incentivizes us to not have relationship with one another. That isolation is a key component of how white supremacy thrives in our not just in reality, but in our soul and in our imagination. We are taught that we are supposed to suffer in silence, that these things are disconnected, that it's a personal problem, that if I'm better, then I'll be better. And there are so many people who are suffering silently with you that it's a revolutionary thing to be able to organize relationally. And so, when we're talking about disrupting systems as a whole, it's never been accomplished on an individual by individual basis. It would require us to have these types of intentional relationships where we do hold each other accountable to disrupting that internalized commitment to these systems, that we do hold ourselves accountable to not just holding on to tools of survival, and to recognize that survival tools and liberation tools are not the same thing, even though sometimes they're dressed up as and presented as being the same thing sometimes. And most of all, you want to have somebody that has your back when you receive the blowback that you're going to receive, because there is no change that is made without consequence, and there's no change made without sacrifice. And so if you're able to fall back on community, which historically as Black people, that's all that we had. We, especially before we were, especially throughout our history, we have had only ourselves, no institution, no structural form of power that everything that we've been able to accomplish, we accomplished because we had each other. And so that's, I'll land my plane there. But those two things, in disrupting the internal commitment and building relationship, are going to be extremely important.
I want to add a little personal piece to this because that resonated with me so much. I think it's an experience I'm living right now, and I feel like it's relevant to this conversation. I had a colleague at work who, I don't know that they see me as a colleague. It's like this Black lady who just showed up in this space that doesn't have any other Black women in it. And I've been on the receiving end of these brute, forceful, just disrespectful emails. I don't tolerate that. I don't care what the culture is, where you come from, who you used to talking to. When you talk to me, you ain't talking like that. And so I give you a warning the first time. I'm like, hey, I would appreciate when you communicate with me, we focus on these things, right? If it happens again, I'm like, white radar turned all the way down, Black radar turned all the way up. I'm not here to play with you. And so I actually sent Larry some screenshots because I was like, I'm furious. Like, I mean, at the point I got to tell you to correct your mannerisms because of your emails is problematic. And I'm thinking about going to my supervisor, who is a white gay man, and saying to him, I wish that when we transition to this campus, that you had brought some other Black women with you. Because at least when we were at a previous location, I had 4 or 5 other people who were telling you the exact same things from different departments, different areas of the campus. So my experience was validated because I wasn't the only one bringing up the issues. And I said, now I got to fight even with you, somebody who's known me for 5 years, about things that you know is true, but I can't even help you validate it at all because I don't have any other numbers behind me. I don't have any other support behind me to say, no, this is a lived experience. This is truly happening in all these ways. And then one of my white colleagues comes in this week, literally this week, and she goes, can we cuss on here? She's like, I'm tired of this shit. That's what she said. She said, every week, you and my other colleague of color, every week she did like this, every week. And I was like, oh, she's been around me too much. But she called it out. She said, what can I do? She says, what can I do? I've never known my community, that's what she said, to be this way. And so she wasn't coming to me saying, Sarah, solve this problem for yourself. She said, Sarah, I don't have any formal training in this. What do I do? So of course, I directed her some places that she could go. But I also said, when you see it, you can validate it. Because right now, I'm being invalidated every time I call it out. Every time I say it, people are telling me not focus on culture, just learn to play the game better. I've been playing the game better. I played the game the best because the game was rigged the moment I stepped in. So I had to get to the table by playing the game better than everybody else. That is like they don't see that, right? And so hearing you talk about this, when we start talking about actively disrupting different levels of privilege, even in a role that I'm in, I do believe that as an administrator in higher ed, I have more privilege than my colleagues who work in in secondary and like A through like A segments, because you all have different expectations on a educational level than I have to meet. When I step into the classroom as a college professor, my goal is to help you think critically. All the learning that you were supposed to do was already expected of you before you came into my classroom, right? But because I know that, I also expect that I'm going to be talking about stuff that you don't know. So I'm going to peel it back and say, you know what? Let me ask you this question first. How many of you are familiar with these terms, familiar with these works? And I know it sounds like it's not related, but it is. You show up in a meeting with your colleagues. How many of you familiar with what I'm about to talk about? How many of you have confronted these issues before, right? It takes you all the way back to that education that you got from those K through 12 educators and how they showed up in those spaces and how they had to work through those spaces for us to be here, right? And so disruption to me, it's not always, somebody used the term martyrs earlier. It's not always a martyr system, but it is gathering support. And I say that to my colleagues of color all the time. I said, the first thing you need to do is get some numbers. I said, because the moment you go alone, you out of here. Because it's so much easier for me, especially at a at wheels institution, please. They're like, oh yeah, they didn't do well on their last performance. They're out, right? And so, I mean, not literally, but they can do that, right? And so get some numbers behind you. I'm like, you are recognizing a pattern. You need some numbers behind you. You need some people who are going to validate that what you are saying is true. And so, Kamau, when you said that, I was like, this is the rhetoric that I teach to my colleagues all of the time. And I got in trouble for plenty of times. They're like, you should not be encouraging colleagues to discuss this, and this. At one point, it was about pay. I said, actually, that's outdated. Forbes, da 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 da. All these resource places have said, actually, you should encourage people to talk about this because it disrupts these things. So I'm well within my role to suggest that to my colleagues. So I sometimes I just take a scale back because I understand on a larger level, I have a positional authority and a positional seat that gives me so much more privilege to just call stuff out. And sure, I could get terminated for it, but I'm gonna sue your ass because that's within my job to do that. But you don't have that positional authority. So let me tell you how to get it. Let me tell you how to navigate in the space that you were in so you can do it safely and cause problems to arise, right? Because that's what's going to happen. The moment you organize, problems start popping up. It's not like you're going to do this and it's going to be smooth sailing. Everything going to be bumpy. You're going to be like you on the North Sea. You're going to be sick, tired, worn out because now all the focus is on you, but you got support. And that's the first way to disrupt is having some support if I'm starting, from the bottom going up.
Yeah, and I think something that Sarah just said that resonated with me is like, yes, community, yes, community. And I always say like we have a responsibility to our lineage, like, and I believe that, like, we have a responsibility to our lineage. And if our ancestors didn't believe they had a responsibility to their lineage, we wouldn't be doing the stuff we're doing. We wouldn't be where we're at. And so it is disheartening when I experience people that look like me that don't know that we have a responsibility to our lineage because it makes me concerned for my daughter, right? And it makes me concerned for generations after us when we don't believe that we have a responsibility to that. I think the other piece that Sarah named and that Kamau named that are making me think about, we also have a responsibility to educate ourselves. And because we are moving in such an anti-intellectual way as a society, that is very scary, right? A lot of people not reading, like, I don't know if we're gonna cuss on here, but like we not reading. Like, I don't know why we not reading, but we not reading. And you need to read. Like, you need to read. That is how you're going to inform yourself, because what I love to do is similarly arm people of color in everywhere I work with the language, the research, the data to back what they are saying, because we're not moving off of feelings and vibes, babe. The research says X, Y, and Z. So I don't really know what you're talking about, but this is what the research says. The data says your Black students are not having a positive experience at your school. What are you doing about the data? Like, you have to be okay with pulling in data research. And in order for that to happen, you need to be well read. You need to be a prolific reader. You need to know your stuff, because that's when they get silent. Because we not going off of feelings and vibes. The data says this. And now they're silent because they're like, it's not Nell's opinion anymore. Like, it's not my opinion. This is what the data says. And that truly is what makes them afraid when they see that you are an educated Black person. You understand, you are informed, because that is truly the weapon, to have the knowledge that they try to hide and pretend is not there and gaslight you about. No, no, no. When you're equipped with it, you can make informed arguments and decisions and advocate for what you need to advocate for. But enough of us are not equipped with that information, so we operate in fear of what could be a potential consequence. when my lawsuit worked just like they lawsuit. So like, what are we doing? You know what I'm saying? Like, and I think that that is what I believe is the work of K through 12 educators is we need to start critical thinking skills way sooner for our students. And I'm the one that will do it. Like when Black students come to me like, Miss Williams, this teacher did X, Y, and Z racist. I'm like, okay, great. Pull up your Google Chromebook, start writing up the email, CC the principal, CC me. See, I'm equipping them with this is how you start to advocate for yourself. Put it in writing, right? And they're ready to advocate. And I don't remember if I told you this, Larry, but like one of my colleagues had said to me, like, I just wish like, you would support the non-Black adult if a child is having an experience as opposed to equipping the child with the skills to I said, no, no, no. We're teaching Black and brown children transferable skills. Transferable skill is, baby, you need to be able to advocate for yourself. And then the coaching conversation happens with the email. Hey, this is the experience this student is having. Regardless of your intent, this was the impact. This was the impact. And now this baby is equipped to advocate, and you are now aware of this is the potential consequence is your job, babe. When you don't show up like this is the consequence. And I think that that's the pieces we're often trying to protect. And it's like, no, babe, you're going to be uncomfortable. This child is equipped to hold you accountable, and they will. And so here we are, right? And I think that that's the piece is like staff of color, administrators of color need to have the tools to be able to empower the students that we work with. Do I think this role would not be anti-Black in my child's lifetime? No. So we need to have the tools to navigate it. And that is our responsibility as the administrators in these spaces to equip people with the tools.
One of the things that I'm hearing coming out of this conversation is community. We have to stand in solidarity. It cannot just be one person doing the disrupting, interrogating the bias, et cetera, et cetera. We have to do this in community. The second thing that I'm hearing is read. We have to build our own knowledge around the problems that exist for Black and brown people, particularly if you're a person that does not understand the ways in which anti-Blackness shows up in a variety of different or all of our spaces within the United States specifically. And then we also need to educate, and that comes through PD, that comes through all of the one-off meetings that we have where we talk about, the data and the student experience. I also just want to, when I think about your job as an attorney, Kamau, like in the legal sector, we also have to push people on the way in which they view Black and brown people when they look at, certain cases or situations where this Black person is being accused of this, and then being able to ask ourselves, do I think that because of their identity, or do I think that because the evidence that, is available, lends itself to that line of reasoning? And so I think, when I think about, all the different parts of our society, we have to do the unlearning. If we do not unlearn it, we're just going to continue to perpetuate the system that is in everybody's life oppressive, even the oppressor. And I think the Paul Freire in Pedagogy of the Oppressed gets at that the oppressor is still oppressed. They don't understand the ways in which they are oppressed because they're operating as the oppressor, but it is just so. And so I want to leave our audience today, as we end our live talkback, with the idea that if this conversation challenged your thinking, continue to have the conversation with everyone else that's in your network, because this is the reason why Education in Context exists. Is there any final thoughts?
I was just going to say thank you, Kamau. Thank you, Sarah, for coming on, because it does matter that we're continuing these conversations, and it does matter that people know that they have solidarity in us in having these conversations. And I know we were thinking about whether or not we say Happy Valentine's Day, but we can't say it's Happy Black History Month. I hope this month you choose
Yes,
to
yes,
find
yes,
a book
yes.
that is empowering you to navigate these systems in an intentional way so that you can empower somebody else. And join us for our next episode, which is releasing when, Mr. Bynum?
It is dropping tomorrow. Get excited. It's episode 2 of Education in Context, and I'll leave it at that. Really quickly, Dr. Sarah, Attorney Kamau, any final thoughts as we wrap it up with our audience?
Both
No.
of us were trying to be polite. Did you see that? No, thank you both so much for having us on the show. As I told you in our pre-discussions, I'm so thankful to just have been invited into a space where I was not the teacher, the primary teacher, where I was also able to sit back and absorb and hear and be reinvigorated about the work. Because I'm gonna tell you, sometimes it gets stale just being that person that's always doing it. But it's so helpful and so reassuring to think about my other colleagues who are still fighting the good fight and still putting in all that work and all that effort, all that emotional labor to keep pushing unity and pushing education. I mean, at the core of everything we're doing, we're empowering people and pushing education. And also, T, if you need some help with that, contact S. Liddell Solutions, okay? S. Montgomery Solutions, so we can come through and help you get on board. And then I'll pull in Larry, Nell, and Kamal, and all of us will show up, if you need some help.
Period.
I just have to say, a big thanks for having us on here, and a thank you for even having this platform in general. I think especially like in today's media environment, we need to have conversations like this. We need to make sure that we are speaking directly against anti-Blackness, that we are speaking directly in support of our youth, our children, our community. So a big thanks for that, and I'm looking forward to watching the next episode. So.
Great. Thank you. Thank you to the viewers watching. Remember, education in context exists to move us beyond awareness into transformation, reimagining systems so every learner can thrive in community. Thank you.
All right.